Welcome to Season 2, Episode 7 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share some thoughts on how to be thoughtful and responsible in the way that we teach kids to show grit and perseverance and resilience. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the transcript, links to recommended resources, and to share your thoughts on the show. So, grit is a huge buzzword right now that's used to refer to perseverance and resilience. And many schools are rushing to adopt grit curriculums and character education programs so that they can teach their students about how to put in the effort and determination that's needed in order to be successful. But here's the thing about grit. I've done a lot of research on this topic, and I've seen grit get a lot of pushback lately because it's starting to be really misused and misinterpreted. And while I personally believe in the value of teaching grit to students, I think that we as educators have a responsibility to be really well informed about what being gritty means and also what it doesn't mean. So let me first define what grit is not. Grit is not an excuse for giving boring, inauthentic assignments. We can't photocopy a stack of multiple choice worksheets and call that our lesson, and then accuse students of not showing enough grit when they're disengaged. We can't fill the school day with busy work and rote learning and then blame kids' lack of growth on the fact that they didn't try hard enough. Grit isn't supposed to be a guilt trip that places a burden on someone else to complete meaningless tasks that we give them. Grit is about persevering toward goals that we care about. We have to give kids real problems to solve. We have to make their learning matter in the real world. Yes, they need to take responsibility for learning, but we have to give them things that are worth learning about. We have to empower them to take on student-led projects and teach them how to take ownership of their learning. Also, grit is not a replacement for eradicating poverty and racism and inequities in school funding. We have to be very careful not to use grit as a way to shift blame from our society or our government on to students. We can't say, hey, there's this one kid in your neighborhood who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and he became a neurosurgeon. You're just not trying hard enough. Show some more grit. That kind of attitude has been particularly pervasive towards students of color, as if all they need to do in order to be successful as white children in upper-class neighborhoods is just work harder. We can't expect a 9 or 10-year-old kid from a poor neighborhood to overcome things like white privilege and lack of parental support and parental education, inadequate nutrition, unsafe home and community environment, the damage that the stress of poverty does to the human brain, and all those other challenges that they might be facing simply by showing grit. We can't take our responsibility as adults for eradicating poverty and place it on the backs of little kids. We can't blame children for not single-handedly overcoming the effects of poverty and racism through their own willpower. So we really have to be careful with the way that we present grit to kids. Thirdly, grit is not a replacement for actual learning. For many years now, education experts have been training us to stop telling kids they're smart and start praising effort and hard work. And that's a positive shift, in my opinion, because it helps kids develop a growth mindset and helps them believe that success comes through hard work. But it can backfire if we send the message that hard work is the only thing that matters and success is irrelevant. We can accidentally lead our children to believe that grit or trying is more important than actual learning. At some point, students in schools have to be accountable for whether or not they succeed in meeting goals. It's not enough for a kid to try really hard to learn how to read if at the end of the year, the child's still on the same reading level as when they started. We can't take this feel-good route of using grit as a self-esteem builder. We can't just praise grit without asking the hard questions about whether we as educators have supported students sufficiently in meeting goals. I mean, sure, a kid showed perseverance, they showed resilience, they didn't stop trying, but did he actually succeed? And if he didn't, why not? What can we do better as teachers to help him cross the finish line? How can we support that student not only in taking responsibility for his own efforts, but for his own learning? So those are some things that grit is not. Now let's look at what real grit is all about. Real grit is about high expectations. So while we can't ask kids to overcome systemic societal issues using the sheer force of their own grit, we also can't swing too far in the opposite direction and make excuses for our students. Low expectations are a subtle form of bigotry, where we don't believe in kids' ability to achieve simply because of who they are or because of the communities they come from. We can't just feel pity for students in poverty or kids with special needs or English language learners and just decide it's enough for them to just do their best. We have to believe that all children can learn, and we have to be willing as a school community to figure out what supports they need and put those supports in place. Grit is about keeping high expectations. It means pushing yourself to do more and to improve continually. We want to adapt that mindset ourselves, and we want to teach that mindset to students. Real grit also acknowledges the role of slack. So this is a fact that I don't often hear acknowledged in conversations about grit, and that is kids who live in affluent homes generally don't have to exercise as much grit to be successful as the kids who grow up in poverty or less affluent homes. And I can testify to this firsthand. After many years of teaching in urban Title I schools, I taught for a brief time in a more affluent community. And most of my students were going to learn how to read and write and do math, regardless of how well I taught them. My students were taught academic skills from a very young age, and they came to school already prepared with a wide range of experiences and knowledge. And if they weren't successful in my classroom, their parents would have hired tutors, they would have had them checked out by a pediatrician, they would have gotten them special services. Their parents helped them with homework or did the homework for them in many cases. I mean, in other words, these affluent children had the privilege of some slack. They didn't have to be gritty all the time because they had parental support and money and tons of resources to pick up the slack for them. So slack is a term that was first used in this context by researchers Melanathan and Shafir. And they asserted that children who are raised in affluent homes and go to affluent schools live and learn with a mindset of abundance. These kids are afforded slack everywhere they turn, meaning they have space to make mistakes and take risks and experience failure because they have people there to pick them up when they fall down and to help them overcome the effects of their mistakes. They can rebound more easily from a lack of grit. Whereas children living in poverty and less affluent communities operate in this space of scarcity. They live within tight margins and few choices. One wrong decision or one momentary lapse in grit can have disastrous effects that last for a lifetime, even for generations. They have far fewer opportunities. They have less access to resources that they need to be successful. Kids in poverty can't afford to have an off day. So many people would argue that it's slack and not grit that our students really need. I still contend that grit is an important skill to teach kids, but we have to do it while acknowledging the important role of slack and recognize that slack is a privilege that not all of our kids have. We can work to give our students some slack in the classroom in as many ways as possible, giving them opportunities to take risks and supporting them when they make mistakes and helping them learn to rebound from failure. Last, real grit is nimble and it knows when to shift course. I was introduced to the idea of nimble grit by this year's ASCD keynote speaker, Sarah Lewis. She's the author of a book called The Rise: Creativity, the Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery. So Sarah points out that grit is not about this dogged persistence in tasks that aren't worthwhile. Some things are just not worth pursuing. And people who are true masters of their craft know when to quit. They know when to cut their losses and just move forward in another direction. So we need to teach kids that a gritty person does not just go after every task like a pit bull that latches on and refuses to let go. We have to show kids how to figure out when it's okay to quit and help them understand which tasks are worth pursuing. For example, I explicitly teach students that they don't have to finish every book they start. Many kids don't realize this. They don't realize that real readers give a book a fair chance, but if you're not hooked on a book after a while, a real reader is going to decide the book isn't a good fit for them right now and choose something else. That's nimble grit. I'm not going to give up on reading, but I'm also not going to force myself to read a 300-page book that's just not doing anything for me. Nimble grit is about pursuing things that matter to you and goals that are worthwhile, and knowing when to shift courses, knowing when to pivot into a different direction so that you're channeling all that energy and hard work into something that really matters and is going to produce results. So I'll leave you with one of the best and easiest ways I found to teach kids about grit, and that is to give specific feedback that guides students to identify how they achieve success. A lot of times kids are successful in tasks, but they don't really understand what they did that led to their success. So integrate grit vocabulary into your daily routines and continually point out when students demonstrate those qualities and the types of results they got from that. So you might say, wow, this was really hard for you, but you persevered, and now you've almost got it. Or you could say, you had a setback when your strategy didn't work, didn't you? But you found resources to help you. You showed a lot of resilience, and look, it paid off. You could even end the school day on a daily basis by having kids turn and share ways that they've shown grit that day, or they've been perseverant or been resilient, or even ways that they struggle to show grit, and then brainstorm strategies for doing better tomorrow. The takeaway truth that I'd like to leave you with this week is a terrific Zig Ziglar quote, and it goes like this: if you're not willing to learn, no one can help you. If you're determined to learn, no one can stop you. Thanks for listening. Have a fantastic week. You can do this, and remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Truth for Teachers is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. For more great podcast recommendations, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. That's edupodcastnetwork.com.